Today's video is how I took this solid slab of black walnut and turned it into a cutting board. This was a custom request by a customer who wanted something fairly specific. They wanted it to be one solid piece of wood, no glue ups or anything like that. And this was the perfect piece for them. As you can see, it's about just over 2 inches thick and just measures over or right around 18 inches long. Now this will be shaped to size, so the final product won't be that, but it'll be close. The first step for this is to bust out my router sled so I can flatten this board. However, my router sled is not tall enough to handle something over 2 inches in height, so I had to trim up some 2x4s to create a higher table for my router sled to go run over. And now you can see that the router sled passes over the top of the board without touching it. This board had a little bit of a wobble and twist to it, so to stop that, I shim up each caddy corner and create a flat surface so it will no longer move. To do that, I just use some business cards and shim them under. And then after it no longer wobbles, I'm going to run the router sled over the top using my router flattening bit. This is my flattening bit, and this is used to get just on top of the surface, and then I'll slowly run the router back and forth, trimming away a little bit of board at a time until it's completely flat on top. I used to router away a lot at a time. However, best practice would be to just take a small amount of wood away per pass, probably an eighth of an inch or so. And it just works out better. It's less wear and tear on the tools, probably safer. As you can see, when it's all flat, it looks really good. You get the true grain color of it popped out. And I flip the board over and do this on both sides. I don't record both sides, but it's the same process now that this top surface is flat. I got this board from a local woodworker who cuts down trees, and there's a chunk missing on this corner from his manufacturing. And to solve this, I'm just going to take a jigsaw and kind of shape and trim that away. I didn't have a better tool. And I'll come back later with 80 grit sandpaper and really round that over into a more natural look. But this is the best way I found just to clean that edge up, make it a little more natural looking. One edge of this cutting board did have a bevel to it, and I wanted it to be a nice 90-degree, so I clamped it down to this jig on my table saw and ran it through at a nice 90 degrees just to clean that edge up. After that, it's everybody's favorite part, sanding, and I start at 80 grit, and I will work my way up to 220. Things I'm focused on here with the 80 grit is to knock all those edges off from the router sled. I also want to go over the bark on the live edge. Even though I removed most of the bark, this is just kind of those under layers. Anything that might flake off during normal kitchen use, I want to knock all that off. And I ever so slightly want to start rounding out all the corners and edges. To finish that up, I will go over with 120 grit and 220 grit to really smooth out the edges. The customer wanted a juice groove on this live edge, and normally juice grooves are not an issue. I'll use a kind of a jig to make nice solid straight lines. However, because this was not a natural square or rectangle shaped cutting board, it did require some planning. I traced about a ½ inch in from the edges, and then I had to freehand this. It's not my first choice, but it's the only way that I could really see and make this work with the unnatural or maybe more natural bends that usually come in a cutting board. I made 2 shallow passes using that 1/4 inch router bit to create the juice groove. The best way I could think of sanding that juice groove was using a stick with some 120 grit sandpaper wrapped around it and really just manual labor. Unfortunately, there's just no better way for me to get in that groove. In the future, I'm going to use a more rounded router bit for my juice grooves. They'll be a lot easier to sand and, in my opinion, look a little better. Once everything was sanded up, it was time to address these cracks that appeared in the board. And these were a concern to me because they're near the edge and they're running with the grain, and that could lead to splitting farther down the line, and I wanted to avoid that. The only thing I could come up with was creating some epoxy and pouring that into those little cracks. The customer wanted to keep this board as natural as possible. However, to prevent the splitting, he agreed that epoxy would be the best way to solve this issue. I mixed up a small amount of clear epoxy, no dyes or colors, and used a chopstick to slowly drip the epoxy into those cracks. And then I came back about an hour later and filled them in a little bit more until the top of the board was reached. Once the epoxy was dry, I came back with a chisel and scraped away the excess, and then I used my sander to go over and make it flush with the board. After that, I drilled some pilot holes for the rubber feet that will be screwed onto the bottom of the board. I attached the feet near the live edge side of the board, and that's preventing a wobble. Because the customer didn't want me to add a finish to this cutting board, they want to do that themselves, I won't have a good reveal of the colors that show up at the end. So this is spraying water on it to pop the grain before I sand it one final time with 220 grit, but it really shows off the colors that this board is going to have when it is finished and oiled up. I know it's kind of disappointing to not see a big cutting board reveal at the end, but that's just the way this one is. If you would like to see some cutting boards I have finished, you can head over to my website at leafandknot.com. Feel free to leave any comments or questions you have, and I'll be sure to answer them. Thanks.